Okay, obviously we're here at the monument commemorating the spot where Turner Ashby was killed. But I remember when we were back at Dave's get-together meeting and he asked how many people had heard of Turner Ashby, and there were only a few of us that raised our hands. So a little bit leading up to his death. Who was Turner Ashby? Well, Turner Ashby Jr. was born October 23rd, 1828 on the Rose Bank Plantation in Farquhar County, Virginia. His great-grandfather had fought in the French and Indian War. His grandfather was a captain wounded while fighting under General Washington in the Revolutionary War, and his father had been a colonel in the War of 1812. His father died while he was young, and he was raised by his mother and grandmother. Before the war, he was a farmer, a businessman, and a noted horseman. In the late 1850s, he formed a partisan cavalry company with his friends known as the Mountain Rangers. This unit was later absorbed into the Virginia militia after John Brown's 1859 raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and they stood guard during Brown's trial and execution in nearby Charlestown, Virginia. Similar to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Ashby disapproved of secession, but there was no doubt that he would fight for the South when Virginia voted to leave the Union. And I know there's a small one in our booklet, but here is you could pass that around, a photograph of Turner Ashby taken shortly before the war. In 1861, Ashby convinced Governor John Lecter to order the state militia to seize that same arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he was assigned to the command of then Colonel Thomas Jackson. And he and his men were engaged in guarding the bridges and fords over the Potomac River and escorting Confederate sympathizers in and out of Maryland. That June, Ashby's brother Richard was mortally wounded in a skirmish with the Union patrol along the Potomac. When he was told that his brother had been bayoneted while trying to surrender, Ashby rushed to his brother's side and determined that the bayoneting was true. And he immediately came to hate Northerners and became obsessed with revenge. Just 1 month later, he was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the 7th Virginia Cavalry, and he assumed effective control over half the regiment due to the illness of its colonel, Angus MacDonald. When MacDonald retired in February of 1862, Ashby was promoted to colonel the following month, and he assumed command of the entire regiment. One of his first acts as commander was to organize the 1st Confederate Horse Artillery, named Chew's Battery, for its commander, Robert Preston Chew. His command was then shifted to General Jackson's army in the Shenandoah Valley during the spring of 1862. By this time, Ashby was one of the Confederacy's first legends in the making. In the Shenandoah Valley, he was seen as a dashing, charismatic, and astoundingly brave man who had the unswerving loyalty of his men in the way that a lot of Jackson's other officers did not. Jackson knew this, and he was aware of how effective Ashby could be in those lethal areas between armies, in screening Jackson's men and causing havoc for the enemy by blinding them and slowing them down. Ashby's legend was such that some federal prisoners said they believed he had magical powers. They had evidence that they had taken deadly aim at both horse and rider, and their bullets simply could not hit him. While no one can deny Ashby's bravery, he also had some major weaknesses as a commander. He was a very poor disciplinarian who often had little or no control over his men. And for the by-the-book Jackson, Ashby was an administrative nightmare. There were times when he simply failed to obey orders. Once, after neglecting to post guards, 60 of his men were caught asleep in a church and taken prisoner. Later, during a retreat, his men failed to destroy supplies and equipment, including a large supply of military stores as well as 2 locomotives. That was a cardinal sin in Jackson's eyes. Later, when ordered to destroy bridges, his men were found drunk on applejack found in an old foundry. Some of the men, they were charged by federal cavalry, and some of the men fled into the mountains and weren't seen for 10 days. Jackson really had mixed feelings about Ashby, and he was a man he could not bend to his will. He once told his brother-in-law, General Daniel Harvey Hill, that Ashby never had his equal in a charge, but he never had his men in hand, and some of his brilliant exploits were performed by just himself and a handful of his followers. He is too kind-hearted to be a good disciplinarian. That final episode involving the drunken troopers finally prompted Jackson to act. And on April 24th, he divided Ashby's force into two groups of 10 and 11 companies and reassigned them to infantry brigades. Ashby would still be able to control the advance and rear guards, but he would have to apply to the infantry brigade commanders for the men to do it. Surprised by the demotion, Ashby considered challenging Jackson to a duel. And only Jackson's superior rank prevented these two headstrong men from coming to blows. Instead, Ashby responded with a letter of resignation that clearly shows how he felt. He wrote, "This indignity leaves me in utter astonishment. I feel bold to announce the fact, without a fear of sounding vain, that for the last 2 months I have saved the Army of the Valley from being destroyed." Surprisingly, Jackson decided that as imperfect as he was, Ashby's resignation would cause a lot more harm than his remaining in command. So he revoked his order. Ashby, reinstated, made some promises to tighten discipline, and that was the end of it. Although Jackson continued to resist Ashby's promotion to brigadier general. But it finally came through on April 23, 1862. Jackson took this opportunity to urge Ashby to be more careful. "As it seems you are now to command a brigade," Jackson told him, "perhaps the country may now hope for less exposure to your person." As usual, Ashby did not heed his advice. On June 6, 1862, the Confederate rear guard under Ashby was in place along the Port Republic Road, approximately 2 miles south of Harrisonburg, and they took the opportunity to dismount and let their horses graze. Union forces had been moving into Harrisonburg from the south, and the rear guard, made up of Ashby's 7th Cavalry, infantry from the 44th and 58th Virginia and 1st Maryland Confederate regiments, and artillery from Chew's Battery, all under the command of Ashby, had been slowly dropping back before them all morning. Ashby, looking towards Harrisonburg, saw a body of Federal cavalry moving towards him, quote, "with great spirit," and the order "mount and form" soon placed them in readiness to meet the Yankees. Leading the Federal advance was the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, commanded by Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham. And I've got a photograph here of Wyndham that we'll pass around. Wyndham was a 28-year-old English soldier of fortune who came to America, claiming to have been a foot soldier in the French Army, then a Marine in the French Navy, an officer in the British Army, and one of Garibaldi's volunteers in the Italian Army, where he had earned his knighthood. A chaplain described him as, quote, "a military dandy of the first water, with long curls and a profusion of gold lace." He came to Virginia bragging that he would either capture or kill Turner Ashby. Ashby knew about Wyndham's bragging, but he said little about it other than he didn't wish Wyndham to gain any reputation at his expense. Ashby charged to meet the oncoming Federal cavalry and succeeded in holding them off. The Yanks had never faced an Ashby charge, and its fury startled and splintered them. A few attempted to rally and were trampled. Wyndham was quickly surrounded by Confederates. The action was over in minutes. Seeing his men running in panic, Wyndham shouted, "I will not command such cowards," but then was taken prisoner himself. As Federal resistance collapsed, the rebels counted more than 64 prisoners, with 36 Federals killed and wounded versus just one Confederate casualty. After his capture, Confederates kept reminding Wyndham of his pledge to snare Ashby, and he became the angriest prisoner anyone had ever seen. He asked soldiers to stand in the road and fight him with their fists. But then he was heard to say, "We've been smashed all to flinders." He'd be released in a prisoner exchange 1 week later and would go on to become a great pet of General Joe Hooker and be wounded at Brandy Station, which would bring an end to his American Civil War career. So with Wyndham and his men captured, the remainder of the Federals went scampering back into Harrisonburg, reporting their defeat to General Fremont. He sent out a fresh cavalry unit with orders to observe the Confederate rearguard. This regiment carried a crack infantry battalion commanded by Colonel Thomas Kane, known as the Pennsylvania Bucktails, or 13th Pennsylvania Reserves. The Bucktails were skilled hunters that were noted for pinning deer tails to their caps. Ashby offered up a plan to his men. Let the enemy advance down the road and he would encourage them to do it. He would dangle Thomas Munford's 2nd Virginia Cavalry there on the road and draw them on. Munford would have a surprise for the Federals because Chew, the artillerist, would deploy his men and cannon sheltered from enemy sight but ready to blast away when needed. In the meantime, the Southern infantry would deploy in a dense forest of oaks to the right of the road, ready to storm out on the Yankee flank. It was a perfect ambush, but the trap would need to be sprung quickly because it was already twilight. Munford later claimed that he warned Ashby, saying, "General, you have done a handsome thing already today. Do you think they'll be fooled again?" Ashby's reply was, "I am tired of being crowded and will make them stop it after today." So Munford's riders take their places as bait, while Ewell, General Ewell, and Ashby joined the foot column, with Ashby leading the Marylanders. Ashby was moving men towards Chestnut Ridge in order to prepare another ambush when he and his men came upon the advancing Federals. The Bucktails initially held an oblique position and fired into the advancing Confederates at a deadly angle. Initially, both sides were surprised by the moment of encounter and both concluded that they had been ambushed. One of the Bucktails wrote, "The rebels fired upon us, for we were in an ambush. We took cover behind the trees and went at them Indian fashion." Despite this volley of fire into his ranks, Ashby led the 1st Maryland and 58th Virginia regiments to shift their positions and charge at the Bucktails. General Ashby was seen everywhere, urging his men forward, and he was in front of the 58th Virginia when his horse went down, shot. He rolled free, bounced up, and ran at the enemy, waving his swords, yelling, "Forward, my brave men!" The 58th Virginia was closest to the Bucktails and bore the brunt of their fire. Initially, they bolted, but then they stopped and returned some wild firing, actually hitting some of the Marylanders. But then the Confederate attack gathered strength. On the Union side, the Bucktails found themselves under heavy fire with Colonel Kane wounded. Rebel infantry came roaring in on them from all sides, hurling them out of the woods, where many were shot down. As darkness fell, the bloody fight ended, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Federals lost perhaps 50 men, half of those engaged. The 58th Virginia lost 53 killed, wounded, and missing, and the 1st Maryland lost 17 of 150 engaged. As the fight ended, the Confederates looked for Ashby to be hot on the enemy's tail, but he was nowhere to be seen. They remembered that his horse had taken a wound and returned to the spot and found Ashby dead, lying with his face towards the Union lines. He was shot through the chest, the bullet passing through his right arm and exiting the body under his left breast. He apparently had died instantly. Troopers escorted the body from the field in disbelief, and the corpse was taken to the Frank Kemper home in Port Republic. Ashby was the first general of heroic stature to die in Virginia, and news of his death spread like wildfire. Here is the only photo we know of of Ashby in uniform, and it was one taken that evening after he was killed. Jackson was interrogating Wyndham when word reached him. He dismissed the Englishman at once and went into his room and locked the door. His staff heard him pacing a long, long time, and later that evening he went to the Kemper house to pay his respects. 10 months later, when Jackson was writing his after-action reports for the Valley Campaign, he paid an unusually emotional tribute to the fallen horseman. An official report is not an appropriate place for more than a passing notice of the distinguished dead, Jackson wrote. But the close relationship which General Ashby bore to my command will justify me in saying that, as a partisan officer, I never knew his superior. His daring was proverbial, his powers of endurance incredible, his tone of character heroic, and the sagacity almost intuitive in divining the purposes of the enemy. To me, it sounds like Jackson might have been describing himself. Now, as a postscript, after Ashby's death, interim command of his regiment went to Colonel Thomas Taylor Munford. But the 7th Cavalry was an unusually huge regiment, made up, by the time of Ashby's death, of 29 companies. So it was reorganized into 3 different units. The 7th Virginia kept the original 10 companies. The other 19 were divided between the 12th Virginia Regiment and the 17th Battalion of Virginia Cavalry, and also Chews Battery. These units would make up the Laurel Brigade, which is going to feature prominently in just about every campaign for the rest of the war, and it would be commanded by Colonel Richard Henry Dulaney. And that's the story of Turner Ashby.
Terry, you have a soft spot for Stonewall Jackson?
I
and
do.
also for Turner Ashby?
I do.
Okay. If you didn't catch that, you weren't paying attention. That relationship between Jackson and Ashby, similar to Stuart and Lee?
I think so. You know, it's so strange because those of you that have studied Jackson know that he never backed down when he was very, he didn't hesitate to court-martial other officers. And then he would, you know, and then they were kind of dead. Once he didn't trust you, he didn't trust you. But Ashby, I think he had a real soft spot for Ashby because he saw how you know, how effective he could be. But and I think one of the reasons was that unit was just so huge. Colonel Munford once said, gave Ashby kind of a half-hearted, you could take it 2 ways. He said Ashby could control a mob better than others could control a battalion. So his men were often just kind of seen as a mob. But he always led by example. He never said, you know, go charge this. It was always men follow me.